So I'm just right now separating the books because some of them we have duplicates here. So this is the essentially the project is set up to develop a set of standards, and this is the current set of documentation standards for the project. So this is the system overview, or this is the system overview. We have the system. I'll walk you through the standards quickly. This is the system overview. It's essentially a description of a different configuration of society. So when I first came to this direction, I wanted to understand how we could operate a configuration of society without trade, without money, without any form of trade, even just labor tokens, essentially, even without labor tokens. How can we operate a society with no market and without coercion? So essentially without state coercion, which you kind of have to have in a market sort of situation. Because of bad behaviors, you still have to coerce people. Now, at the moment, it goes farther than just having those sorts of crimes. We also have victimless crimes at the moment. So the coercion is deep at the current present point in time. But we're trying to create a new configuration of society. So we can provide an overview of this new configuration of society, a description of what a society is, the fundamental systems that a society is composed of, and we can describe, using that model, the current configuration of society and a future better configuration of society where there is no market and there is no state coercion and we have all of our human needs met. Now, this is a project. Like anything is a project. Society is a project, so you have to have a project plan. So the project plan actually has two parts to it. That's the project plan, and then a subpart is the project execution. So you can see right here, we have the project plan, and then underneath the project plan, we have the project execution because they go together. You execute projects. So this is a project with an approach, a direction, and then an execution. And the direction is global human need fulfillment sustainably on this planet, also facilitating the restoration of our ecology and its ecological services. And that's described here in this document, along with what a project is, because projects in community are handled differently than they are typically in the market state. And then the execution, because we're executing a project to transition to a different configuration of society, which will then itself be operated. So we have to talk about work in here, and we talk about the lists that compose a project, because every project is primary. You execute the lists, so you have to first in an execution document mention the lists that are to be executed, and then the work that has to be done. How is the work to be done? How do we organize contribution? How do we organize labor? And then a transition proposal, because we are transitioning from our present society to a future society. So that's the project plan. So then we have the social system. And so what was the social system? The social system. So every society is composed of four fundamental systems. So you actually get into the standard of which that describes and details the system itself: the social system, the decision system, the material system, with the habitat system as part of the material system, and the lifestyle system. So there are four systems that make up all societies. Any type of society you can imagine: a social organization, a decision organization. At a higher level, an economic system is a decision system. So that's, some people think, where's the economic system? But an economic system is actually the acquisition and transformation of resources into needed goods and services, or you could say the coordination of resources into needed goods and services. So anyway, it's a decision system. Right now, we have a specific type of decision system. In a configuration of society where there is no market and state, you have a different you have a different type of decision system. So first, we talk about the social system, because the social system is really our awareness of what is and what could be and who we are. So you have a social system. Essentially, you could look at it like as the concepts that direct our lives, a social navigation system. It's the direction, orientation, approach to how we connect with one another and our material environment. So this is the social system document. Next, we have the decision system. So here is the decision system, and essentially it describes, this is probably the least complete, even though some of the mathematics is more complete. We talk about economic calculation. There's some individuals who I speak with that are mostly focused on transition, not the final vision, or obviously it's not the final vision, but a vision that has phased out the market state. You could use any sort of terminology in that, but they don't agree with some of the economic calculation. They don't think it's necessary, but this document essentially deals with decisioning and includes statistical economic service calculation, which I think needs to be done if you're dealing with global resources and you're trying to move away from price. So if you still have price, then you're still in a transition system, because then you still have labor tokens or consumption tokens that are then purchasing something based upon a price, regardless of whether they circulate or are deleted. So a decision system. So and this is just as I'm presenting this is a unified system. So if there's a misunderstanding of one system, it could mean a misunderstanding of multiple other areas within the whole system, because it is a unified system. So sometimes people misunderstand one part of the system, which leads to misunderstandings throughout the rest of the system. Then we have the material system, which has two documents. We have the material system document itself, because the material system is broken up into two, kind of like the concept level of the material system, and then the material environment we essentially live in, which we live in habitats. We live in a habitat network, you could say, a global habitat service system network. People use the word cities, people use the word urban, or even urban, suburban, even rural. We all live in habitats. So you have habitat services, and there are three primary axiomatic habitat services that an engineer who's developing a space shuttle would essentially say. There's a life support service, there's a technology or technical support service, and then there's the exploratory support service. And so that's how this document right here is separated into those three core axiomatic habitat service systems. And then the material system essentially talks about what the material system is. It talks about resources. It talks about technologies. It talks about services and access, and then measurement, and also materials themselves. So we have the material system. We have the habitat system, which I essentially described as a city that produces three primary habitat services, in which there are subservice systems. And there are three primary operational processes. There's incident response, there's maintenance and operations, and then there's strategic planning, essentially, like master planning of new versions of the habitat. And then we have the lifestyle system. So then we have the lifestyle system. It's not really it's more kind of like a description of the individuals living in the three phases of life in community, or living through the three phases of life in community. So the three phases of life in community, like the three phases of life in the market state, are you have education, then in community you have contribution, in the market state you have employment, or you're an employer, or you're an investor, you're some sort of trading profession, or you're just living off your inheritance. And then you have the leisure phase, or the retirement phase. Same three phases in community: education, but the language is slightly education, contribution, and leisure phase. But you could still work throughout the leisure phase. One of the goals, the metrics to determine whether or not we're moving in this direction, is a reduction in working years over time. If we were to look at it like a generational thing, it would be how many working years are we reducing the number of working years for the entire population. That's just the written documentation. Like any organization that produces standards, you have to visualize. And so this has been one of the core things we have done at Auravana. We now have over 2,000 visualizations describing this system that I have depicted all in text. and describing the transition. And you can search here. They're all labeled for their position in the standards. So this is the system overview models, and they all start with a model and then the primary system they are categorized within. So if I just click here, you can see model overview, societal engineering simplified. And these are all the overview models. So they're all just essentially described. They're all public domain, whereas the text is Creative Commons. Creative Commons 4.0, because I made all these models, and so they're all public. So in order to contribute to Auravana, the imagery that you release has to be public domain, but the text doesn't, unless the text is going in the image is just going in the document and not on the website. Or maybe I could even do it like that on the website. Anyway, all the images are open source and you can search them. And these are, some of these models are more artistic, but some of these just look like academic, models depicting the vision. Then, of course, we're trying to get organizations in the future to adopt standards, because why does any standard setting organization exist? It exists to get to have the standards adopted. So they're all free. All the standards are free. There's also associated documentation with the standards. So for example, in terms of the project lists, we have a list of all the human needs. We have a project planning flowchart. These are kind of big. We have oversized tables, and then we have the list. So a long list of human needs like NASA would put together for a list of what's needed for someone living on spaceship Earth. Then we have habitat. So any open source project that is producing a habitat I expect would eventually be listed here. My wife, who's an architect, is working on this Aura Curve project habitat. This is a rural restorative low density mineral-based, not bioconstruction-based habitat. The next is a bioconstruction-based habitat for an indigenous group here in Brazil. The next is, although I don't have them listed here, in the future, they will be listed because they are open source as one community. There are very few other whole habitat projects or even whole city projects that you could essentially list here. In the future, you could imagine a whole city and all of the architectural budgets and 2D and 3D specifications listed here for the whole city, where you can look up the architecture of every building. You can look up the full architectural, infrastructural engineering of everything in the environment, essentially. That obviously you cannot do in or it would be very difficult to do in privatized environments unless you have state policy that facilitates that. So essentially, we're beginning to list resource configurations for whole and what's required in terms of production here for whole habitats. You can see kind of where this is going. Then view, we have like a single page overview, iceberg analogy. We just have a bunch of different views. We also have a couple of VR experiences. I created a VR city. One of the goals to get people to understand this new way of living in the future is to give them a VR experience of one of these habitats operating and show all the flows of resources, all the life cycles, etc. Then we have the project itself. We have not a lot of this is online, but I'm just going to bring up, because this isn't online, the one pager and the hashtag, but I'm just going to bring up the hashtag data structure for the project. So we have, this is the hashtag data structure. So what organization was it created and engaged? So this is like essentially we're just looking at a data structure. I'm just putting hashtags in front of it. So we have an organization, we have Auravana, and then what we are trying to disengage from, the market state. What's the proposal plan? These are hashtags. We have a vision, community type society, plan fulfillment, contribution, coercionless contribution, tradeless access, common heritage, habitat access, unlocking human potential. So these are more kind of like directional orientational concepts. Then we have the work plan. Essentially, we have standards developed by working groups, because that's really how society operates, based upon working groups and people working in the material system in habitats. In Auravana, there are only two types of labor, right? There's working group labor, and then there's labor in the habitat. And then the other element of the economic system is access, of which there are two types, and I'll get to that in a second. There's personal and common access, and then there's contribution access, which is the third type of access. And that contribution access is working groups. you're part of a working group or part of a habitat team or part of like some combination of the two. And then we have transition teams during transition. So then we have the information standardization. I won't go through all of this, but you have like just essentially information standardization. Here's the access types. There are three access types in community, two community access types, and then one team access type as part of like, right now you have state access, you have state access, and then you have all these individual business. I mean, you know, all these individual businesses that you're in community, you have unified access, you have contribution access. And then the two other phases of life, because contribution is also a phase, you have education and leisure phases. So what's the material habitat production plan? You have a global habitat, you have a global habitat service. Then you have three service support structures: life, technology, exploratory, and resource cycling. That needs to be accounted for too. Then we have the Auravana standard. We have the societal standard, you know, what the standard is. It's a societal standard. We have the system overview for this new configuration and a description of the current configuration and why it isn't working. We have a plan, then we have the 4 standards. So then what's the purpose or direction as described in the project plan direction section? Then we have the market state transition. We have a little bit about values and orientation, of which are core, and then a set of stabilizing described in the social system, because that's part of social navigation. Then we have what is the societal system change, essentially. We're engineering because, you know, you and I are talking about standards, and so we're talking about engineering a new configuration of society, essentially based upon scientific projects coordination. We understand, we plan, we execute the market transition, the state transition, the political transition, the community political party transition, because there will need to be policy change, and that policy change will need to facilitate the movement of people and resources into a community configuration. And at the state level, a lot of people don't like talking about the state level, but at the state level, you have to then talk about political parties. Some people don't like doing that, but I think you essentially have to. Public transition, public education, increasing and improving that, because essentially we're describing a new, eventually we'll turn this into an education curriculum as well, because what should education really be based on, instead of like the lag between the standards organizations now and the education that people are getting in university, there's a lag. There should no longer be a lag, because they're being educated based upon our standards, which you know, which these organizations are producing. So some of the better universities are like linked with standard setting organizations, so that the students are facilitating the work in the development of the standards, and they're getting to learn about the standards immediately in real time. So we have the standards, and we have what market state changes must occur. First of all, we have to look at resources as common heritage, and that means questioning property. So we have to have a transition of the state executive. We have to have a transition of the legislative. We have to have a transition of the judicial. We have to have a transition of state policies, so state standards, transition of grants, what grants are given, and transition of subsidies as well. State accounting transition, market employer transition, market employee transition, market consumer transition. What about the transition of the habitats? We're transitioning into what you're saying, programmable cities. And what is a programmable city but an integrated total city system, where you're capable of knowing about the whole system, and then you program or create a system that relies on awareness about the whole system. It's just a difference in language. I think we used there are other projects that use total integrated city systems. You can use any of this language: programmable, total, integrated. It's essentially an integratable or integrated system, because you're master planning the whole system, which is why the master plans up here, we're talking about master plans up here, it's the whole master plan that you have access to, because in order to account for resources at the global level, you have to begin master planning habitats at the global level. So then we have the total habitat system, integrated habitat services, integrated light production, integrated heavy production. Although heavy production isn't necessarily integrated within the bounds of these habitat services, but some distance between or outside, because you typically don't do heavy production in inside the city or inside the habitat. Some do, sometimes you do, like in California where you live, where they mine oil inside Los Angeles, but that's more rare. What is the technological transition? So we have coordination. One of the primary transitions that we will experience is AI coordination. It will make our lives so much easier. Then procedural decision software, both for engineering and also for decisioning itself. Global calculated habitat, global calculated operations or calculated global habitat operations, global computational resource allocation optimization, total habitat design services, integrated habitat service operations, and then intersystem team operations. This is the habitat teams that also work with working groups, ensuring the sustained production or continued operation of these habitats. Where you have education, you have contribution, and you have leisure, and you might even have leisure habitats in the future themselves. Then we have community. This comes about through agreement, essentially community agreement, habitat residency agreement. So these are people choosing to then let go of the property in community and begin accessing common heritage, resources, technologies, services in a new configuration of society, where they get access to a personal dwelling, they get community education, community contribution, community leisure provided by the service support systems. And so then each habitat has habitat residency agreements, and then you have a community agreement for the unified global community. And people have to, then you have profiles, you have a habitat residency agreement profiles, and you have to fill out that profile in order to agree to visit or live in a habitat, essentially. Just saying that you'll follow the rules of that habitat, which reside under community agreement. What is the social transition that must occur? Societal social navigation has to change, purpose, the direction, values, the orientation, and then the approach or the methodology, selection of methods. And we inform that by data and knowledge, and also agreements as above. Then the data we have, so when we're talking about certification in terms of like this type of standard, this is kind of where, sorry, I'm kind of getting on with this, but this is kind of where this is certified. You have an identification of the needs of the humans within the habitat, because first you have to identify needs. And I'm talking about not subjective needs, I'm talking about objective needs, which we've listed in the project plan list. You can then have preferences. There are no wants in this system like there are in the market state. You only have needs and preferences within those need categories, which then you can begin running economic calculation on. You do have wants in the market state, but not wants in community. But then you don't even have needs. It's just what you can afford. So really needs are. I talked to a lot of people who I would expect would understand this category in terms of the whole system and the importance of this category, and they're still confused over the importance of this category because they're confusing it with wants and not then separating preferences, which is what. So you have human need identification, human need fulfillment, human preference fulfillment, habitat service production, because the habitat services it requires to be produced in order to meet needs and therein preferences. Then you have resource accounting, and then contribution service accounting. And what are we doing this for in terms of our lifestyle, but to experience some of the greatest states we can experience on the planet in these bodies, essentially flow, the experience of flow. So you have the phases of the flow cycle here, because this is another part of the lifestyle system. Some people refer to it as love, but flow is really more of there's also a more technical term for it. But anyway, flow is like when you essentially feel your best and feel amazing. If you've experienced flow, you know what it's like. And these are the 4 phases of that we can experience every day or cyclically throughout the 3 phases of life: education, contribution, and leisure. So this is why I'm sorry I'm giving kind of like a long-winded overview of this, but there's a lot to hear. And I think when I do this, I'll stop sharing my screen. It's more productive in the end to show you exactly how much we have, and then we can kind of move forward with next steps, because I think we do have a lot already. There's the working group side, and then there's the habitat team side, because we're talking about work toward our direction. So there's working on the working groups. And yes, I mean, I've tried to create this organization so that people is so that it's essentially a working group standards setting organization structure. So that's the way it's written, although we have very few people working on the standards, essentially myself and my wife, who's working on the architecture. We are trying to, we think one of the best ways to begin transitioning, although there are many ways to facilitate transition. One of the ways that we're working on, not necessarily the best, but one of the ways we're working on is creating a rural restorative habitat. And these rural restorative habitats, we can begin testing everything, prototyping a lot of the information and the frameworks that we have within this type of environment. We can begin doing economic calculation on a fully transparent information set that represents some production and life value for the individuals in that environment. And so the production value comes from the restoration part, where the circulars, those habitat circulars are given over to restorative agriculture to produce an abundance of food, fuel, and fiber. So this is essentially just transitioning slowly, given maybe some of the funding that we might be able to achieve in the future, and creating an educational physical educational hub. This is just kind of one of the other sub-projects that we're producing. In association with this, there are other people who we're working with or maybe working with in the future that are developing token models to facilitate a transition of currency and tokens over to this sort of configuration. So I'm kind of long-winded about your answer. What I'm saying is that the project, I think in the future, will have a set of individuals working on the standards themselves, which the standards that ISO, IEEE produce, they actually just fit in the material system. So like you could just take the, in fact, they would fit depending upon the standard itself. You would just literally plug it into this system, and then you'd have the whole information interface that you can see. So then there's the virtual reality project, which is kind of like a transitionary project to help people see the potential of living in these new environments. So yes, I see people in cities in the market state beginning to think about applying these standards. At that level, though, you will need political policy changes. Because of how radically different these standards are, because of socio-technical social associations that are present. You'll have to have awareness in those environments and education, possibly a changing of state curriculum. Or you have the development of this habitat that I'm kind of talking about, this aura curve habitat, where you have a group of people who are aligned, who essentially create a university, like a university habitat or a university city, where you are spreading this information. Those people are living well. You have people coming in, coming out, and you have the prototyping and testing of essentially the whole system itself, where people have habitat agreements. They go through those habitat agreements. They get access to the habitat where they contribute in the contribution phase of their life. And in this model, you might have a token model, or you might have no market model at all.